so we want to honor her time. We're very, very, very excited to welcome Angie Hong, Senior Water Education Specialist from the Washington Conservation District, to speak to us today. I would imagine that many of you are familiar with Angie for all her writings and TikToks and other ways of sharing exuberant and fascinating information about the St. Croix Valley, its history, and its biology. So she will be able to give us some additional perspectives on what we might be doing with People's Park, adding to the fine work that Satoko Murataki and her students have done for the Park Improvement Task Force, and that other faithful volunteers have done to make this park so special over the years, kind of starting many years ago with Judy and Marty Hansen, who created our beautiful labyrinth. So, without further ado, I am very, very pleased to welcome Angie Hong. Woo-hoo.
All right, one moment. I just got adjusted down for short people like me. There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I was just saying, if this was a boat, we'd be like listing to the left. Most people are on the sunny side, and then we have a handful over here in the shade. So my name is Angie, and I've been working at the Washington Conservation District since 2006. And was invited to talk a bit today about native landscape restoration and indigenous land management. And I thought it might be useful to start by kind of, talking about what is my area of expertise and what is not my area of expertise. So as a watershed educator, I think of myself as the connector. And I am not necessarily the subject matter expert about indigenous culture, about botany, about zoology, but I am connected to all these different subject matter experts, all these different organizations, all these different people. And so I think of myself as like a person that's kind of spokes on a wheel, that's helping you to figure out where you can find information, where you can find resources, and how to get inspired and excited. And just a note about myself, I did actually grow up UCC. It was called Congregational at the church I went to in California, and United Church of Christ at the church I went to in Wisconsin, and now we go to Trinity Lutheran because it's within walking distance of our house. So there you go. But it was lovely to join in the tail end of your church service this morning. So I did bring along a few, I probably don't have enough photocopies of things for everybody, but I did bring along a few photocopies of things that I'll be talking about today. And I am also going to put you to work and doing something a little tactile and hands-on as we're talking as well. But I thought it might be useful to start by thinking about this place in the world and what it looked like 14,000 years ago. Okay, so we're going to take a big step back. We're not just going to take the 150-year step back. We're going to take the big step back 14,000 years ago to when all the glaciers were just starting to retreat. And they're leaving behind this giant river valley that we see here today. You know, when you're standing up on the cliffs and the water's down below. At that time, the water was up to the top of the cliff. They're leaving behind all the pocket depressions, all the lakes, and all the wetlands that we see here today. The water soaking into the ground. It's leaving behind the aquifers, the drinking water that we're using today. And it was not too long after that people first started arriving in Minnesota. So according to the archaeological records, people were living in Minnesota as far back as 12,000 years. So get that in your mind, 12,000 years ago. And just imagine what was happening in this entire North America at that time. 12,000 years ago, we still had woolly mammoths. We still had like saber-toothed tigers. It was a completely different world then than it is today. The records show that people were in Wisconsin as early as 10,000 years ago. So you can imagine that they probably were arriving on the northwestern edge of Minnesota and taking about 2,000 years to gradually migrate across and make it to the other side of the river and make it over into Wisconsin, and kind of kept spreading eastward and southward from there. But I say this as an introductory to the idea that the world is constantly changing, nature is constantly changing, people are constantly changing. So when we start talking about landscape restoration, one of the things that we lean on really heavily in the conservation world is this thing called the Marshner map. And I think, I'm going to say I printed out about 25 copies of these. So I'm going to do like this big leap forward from, 14,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, to where we usually start the story. All of us who are of European American descent, usually we start the story of Minnesota somewhere around 1837. So, there was like this whole 10,000 years of life that was happening in Minnesota, people being here, different, and it wasn't even necessarily the same groups of people over the time. People would come, people would go, people would migrate, new people would come, new people would go and migrate. And around 1837 is when the European Americans, who had of course established a new nation, had gradually been migrating inwards, fighting with the native people along the way. They arrived at what is called Minnesota and signed a treaty with the Dakota people in 1837 that allowed Minnesota to start becoming a state, people to start settling in this area. So in 1847 is when land surveyors started surveying everything which we now call Minnesota. So they went through meticulous detail and they recorded all of the trees that were here at the time, all of the different plant communities that were here at the time, and they made this wonderful map that I'm holding here in my hand. And, this is where we get the idea of Minnesota having its three major biomes, of having its prairie areas, this yellow area, of having its big woods, and of having the north woods, the pine woods that we think about. So I'll go ahead and pass this around, and I think there's probably enough copies for everybody to have one, but if you came with a pair, if you're a couple, you could probably share. And I normally have such a loud, robust voice, and I just was taking 30 fifth graders up to Wolf Ridge for 3 days at the end of their school year, and so came home with a kind of weak voice and a cough, and I'm like, oh, it's going to take me like a week to recover from the exhaustion of being with 30 fifth graders for 3 days. So we have these Marshner maps, and land managers and land conservationists today are very often in the place of looking at the landscape and trying to figure out what used to be here if we are talking about land restoration. So, I think most of us are pretty familiar with what happened during that course of time between 1837 and now. We gradually had more and more European Americans migrating into the area. We, of course, had an entire timber industry that sprung into being that cut down almost all of the forests that were in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. Most of the areas that were prairie were converted into farmland. And then, of course, we have all of the cities that exist today that have been building and continue to grow. So continue to grow, continue to grow. I would say it was sometime around the 1970s is when people first started really thinking about actively restoring landscapes back to what they used to be. And so what we usually use as our marker of what they used to be is what you're seeing here on these maps. And we're looking at places like the People's Park where we're sitting. And I only brought one copy each of these, but can you all see how there's like orange on one side and yellow on the other? We're sitting in the middle of the square that is, half in the orange, half in the yellow. So this is an area that was half prairie and half oak openings and barrens. And most people know what prairie is. Most people don't necessarily know what oak openings and barrens are. But I think the best way that I could describe what that is a prairie with oak trees growing in it. So, and it's a continuum. So, you might have a wide open prairie that has almost no trees. You might have a few trees, more and more and more trees, until gradually it's going to transition into being an actual forest. So the oak openings and barrens, they are going to have scattered oak trees, and less than 50% of the canopy is covered by trees. So there's still open areas, and the plants that grow down below are still very much going to be prairie kinds of plants. I think, so for just like a little bit more close-up view, this shows just the metropolitan area. And what I will point out is that the top map is what the land cover was in 1847 to 1907. The bottom is what the land cover is today. So I think what might be useful, first of all, is to think about these oak openings and barrens, how they came to be and how they are maintained. Because I told you earlier that nature is always changing. So we know that, 14,000 years ago, this whole area was covered in glaciers, and the glaciers were retreating. All sorts of different kinds of wildlife lived in this area. In places where it is these prairies and oak openings, the natural succession that nature would go towards if there was no other influence is that it would go towards being a forest. So you might be familiar with the fact that in a lot of our state parks in this area, picture someplace like Afton State Park, it seems like they're constantly having to battle back against the trees and the brush that are always threatening to crowd in. And this is just kind of the natural way that that nature acts if there is no influence. However, we actually have had human influence in this area for 10 to 12,000 years. So oak openings and barrens are very much a human influenced landscape, and they exist in other parts of the country as well. There's oak savanna areas in California, there's some oak savanna areas down in northern Texas, but they are an area which is managed by having grazing of large animals and also having periodic fire. And in the absence of grazing and in the absence of periodic fire, these areas will always succeed to being forest. So we see a lot of that here in Washington County. We go to lots of woodlands where people from my office are going and visiting with the woodland landowners, and you're walking around and it looks like it is a maple aspen forest. You're walking through, it's very much got, that beautiful dappled shade, and then every once in a while you'll find a handful of oak trees, and especially if you reach down and you touch the soil and it's really dry and sandy, those are two of the big cues that our office is looking for to go, oh, this actually 150 years ago was probably oak barrens. This was probably, the dry soils was very much something that the prairie plants grew well in. The oak trees were, the original trees that were there, and all of these maples and aspens have kind of moved in because we no longer have the periodic fire, and we no longer have the large grazing animals like the bison and the elk that are, keeping these small trees from growing up in their place. Okay, so this is where I'm thinking. So maybe I'll just tell you a bit about a couple of those handouts that I handed out, as long as they're sitting in your hands. The first one I think was pretty self-explanatory. It's just kind of interesting to look at all the different kinds of land covers and land types that were in Minnesota at the time of European settlement. The second one, if you look at it, this is just calling out the metropolitan area. And you can see that in almost all of Washington County, we were either prairies or oak savanna, oak barrens areas. And when you look at it today, everything that is red in there is areas that have now been developed. And then I cannot remember what the color is, but there's another color for cultivated land. So we really have very few pockets anymore that are very, very few that are remnant prairies that are still remaining that were never touched. And then we have a slightly larger quantity of prairies that are restored prairies. Statewide, it is less than 2% of the original prairies still remain. So if that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the change in the landscape over the past 150 years, there used to be prairies covering a full 1/3 of the state. And today it's less than 2% of those that are remaining. So it's a very, very, very small amount compared to what was originally here. Trying to decide which order to do things in. I know. I'm like, should we talk about prairie roots first? Yeah, let's talk about prairie roots. Okay. So, just gonna use my non-amplified voice here and kind of turn this around and make it into a little table. Okay. So, I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of plants that grew in the prairie and the kind of plants that we have today, and I think this will all kind of connect together for you. I'm going to pass around some cards, and I think for ease and simplicity, maybe we'll just give everybody like one card, and we'll have like one skein of yarn for, every two people. I'm pretty sure I've got enough scissors for everybody. But you might get a card and it's going to say something like compass plant. It's native to North America, grows in full sun. The height is 5 to 10 feet tall. And then it says roots are 15 feet deep. So what we're going to do, this is, I could either call it a reverse bouquet or maybe we could call it a root mobile. But basically we're going to be measuring out these skeins of yarn to make the lengths of the roots. And if you were a compass plant, you wouldn't just have one root, you would have, a whole bunch of roots that are reaching down into the ground. So if you got a card that said compass plant, you might want to measure out like 2 or 3 lengths of yarn that are about 15 feet long. Now, I didn't bring a tape measure, but I don't know how many of you know this. It's a pretty cool trick, is that in general, if we're just estimating, this is about 1 foot long. Most of us are forearm if you're just kind of estimating from your wrist down to your elbow. So we could pretty easily, if we were doing a program like this, we could measure and say, okay, that's 1 foot, and we'll just kind of keep measuring until we get 15 feet long. So I'm just going to kind of give you, we'll get it all into everybody's hands, and then that will give you something tactile and hands-on to be working on while I start talking about plants. All right. Do you want to, maybe you can go with like yarn and scissors, and I'll start like giving people.
So everybody gets a screen?
I think they'll probably have to share.
Yeah.
You want to be the compass plant? Oh, you get a good one too. You get lead plant.
All right.
All right. Yep. Butterfly weed? It's one that butterflies.
This is your wheelhouse right here. You knit too? I don't know if Angie, are they supposed to have specific colors of yarn?
No.
Okay.
No. Let's see. If you were helping to pass out, two of these are invasive species. We'll skip those and just kind of. Okay, wonderful. Is there anybody else who didn't do one? Thank you.
Very easy. 1 foot.
Okay, it looks like everybody
Snip, done.
Mine's even easier. I'm 6 inches.
She wants to get it handed out and then figure out the rest. Are you guys ready? Yep, we're ready for you.
All right. Do we need some scissors over here in this zone?
Okay, Pearl doesn't have anything.
Oh, you got scissors. Okay, wonderful. You need scissors? No? Okay. Yep, we're just doing the roots length.
I've already done
everybody's just got one card, and you could measure out, however many roots you want to measure out for your one card. If you have a 15-footer, maybe you're only going to want to do, 3 because it's going to take you so long. If you have a 4-footer, maybe you could do like, a whole seed roots.
You guys have another card?
Oh, yeah. Ooh, I've got just the one for you, Miss Blue Stuff.
Specific to colors? Or?
No, there is no rhyme or reason to the colors. It's just that, yeah. So if you were, for example, somebody cutting a cup plant like I just was, and you had a 15-foot root, you end up with your 15-foot root here.
Green or purple.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so this is what you're going to end up with.
Use whatever.
Okay, so while you are, just go ahead and keep, measuring out your roots, and we'll kind of pull these all together into, you know what I'm actually thinking? I might be able to tie one main rope here, and we can have the roots kind of blowing off in the wind. I'm picturing that looking kind of cool. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the roots then while you're doing this, while you are measuring and cutting your roots, because this is actually a really important part of the story of what used to be here and what is here now and what the problems have been along the way. Those of you who have a prairie plant are noticing right away that these prairie roots are incredibly, incredibly deep, correct? So these incredibly deep roots are adapted to having periodic droughts, to having periodic large rainstorms, to having dry, sandy soils, to being able to survive fires. And so there's this incredible amount of biodiversity, biomass that's existing beneath ground in a prairie. And it appears above ground to be this really, really fertile ecosystem. And there's tons of different insects, there's tons of different birds, there's all sorts of mammals, there's skinks, there's snakes, there's turtles, all sorts of life that is living here. Even after a fire, these roots remain alive and the plants will continue living. They just bounce right back again and they continue living. Whereas the shrubs and the less fire adapted trees like the maple trees and the aspen trees, they die when a fire comes through. The oak trees, they have a thick enough bark that they're able to survive the kind of light fire that would go through a prairie. This isn't like the kind of fire you have it's getting aggressive. It's not the kind of fire that you would have in the California redwoods. We're not talking that kind of fire. We're talking about a light and fast fire that's going to go through in a pretty quick time. It's low. It's going to kill off trees like the aspens and the maples, but the oaks are going to be able to survive, and all these deep-rooted prairie plants are going to be able to survive. In that root system underground, there's also a whole ecosystem of mycorrhizae. They are like the bacteria and the fungus, and it's like they have these symbiotic relationships. And this is what helps to break down the nutrients to help make it available for the plants. So all of this is going on down below ground, and all of this is going down with these really deep root systems. And when European Americans first came here and saw this just wide open prairies with no trees growing, they thought to themselves, aha, this is the perfect place to plant a farm, because look at how fertile it is. Look at how well the plants are growing. And so they came in and they plowed up and started planting crops. And I think most of you are familiar with the story of the Dust Bowl, right? So what happened is we started planting crops that are things like corn plant, have roots about this deep, wheat plants that have roots about this deep. A lot of these annual plants that get harvested in the fall are sitting all winter long with nothing down in the soil. And in addition, by breaking up the plants and the roots, that also destroyed this community of mycorrhizae that helped to make the nutrients available for the plants to use. So the two results of this, or three results, I guess I would say, is first that it created a lot of erosion. And to this day, this is a constant challenge that we have in our agricultural areas. That during the winter, during the spring snow melt, we have a ton of erosion because we don't have those deep root structures holding the soil in place. And I have copies of the Pioneer Press from back in the 1930s showing just huge ravines in this area, going down to the St. Croix River, talking about the pestilence of the erosion. They used really dramatic language in the newspapers back in the 30s. So it created this big problem with that kind of erosion. The next problem it created is that when we have these periodic droughts, which we always have, we've always had a cyclical climate that has periodic rainy seasons and periodic drought seasons. So during the 30s, when we had a whole series of droughts over the course of 10 years, the soil just dried up and started blowing away. And this was especially problematic down in the Great Plains areas, the places like Oklahoma, northern Texas, Kansas, Nebraska. But even here in Minnesota, that was a big problem. If any of you ever make it up to like northwestern Wisconsin, in the area kind of around Cricks Meadows, that whole area was kind of a failed settlement. So people came in and tried to settle that area in the 1930s, or just prior to the 1930s. And by the time 1940s rolled around, about half of the land had ended up going tax forfeit. People just moved away. They couldn't make a living on it. And that's to our benefit today, because most of that land has now been put into public protection. So we have the Cricks Meadow Wildlife Management Area, we have the Namakagon Barrens Wildlife Management Area, we have a lot of protected space, but it's because of people trying to settle and not being able to successfully farm. The third challenge is that, like I said, when it was prairie and we had the mycorrhizae, it was constantly making the nutrients available for the plants to use, and the plants from the previous year would, of course, senesce in the fall, and they would fall down and decompose, and their nutrients would become available to feed the next year's plants. That doesn't happen in our modern farming systems because we harvest the plant in the fall and leave the soil bare, and then we start over again in the spring. And so the result is that we have to constantly be adding in nutrients. We no longer have a circular cycle. We now have a one-way cycle where we put nutrients in the form of fertilizers, we harvest the plant, we take the plant away, and the next year we put new nutrients in. And so it's more of, I've heard it described as mining. It's almost like we're mining the soil of its nutrients, using it to grow the plants, but it's not a circular cycle the way that it used to be. Okay, so who's got do people have roots here? So is there can we reach it? I don't want you to die.
I don't want to die either.
Well, here, why don't before we do that, why don't I've got like a little rubber band, and let's kind of try to just like put this all together in as like almost like a bouquet. So everybody just give me your ends. Yeah, give me your ends. Let's see if we can successfully do this. All right. Here. All right. Oh, you've got more than one end. All right. All right. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna be like Charlotte Web.
Angie, we've got a couple here.
We got some over,
Whoa,
over in the shady half of the boat.
Like me? Oh my goodness. Whoa,
There's a long one
was
there.
someone longer than my 9-footer? Holy cow. Those must be 12 or 15 footers. Wow. Mine's the big blue stuff. 9.
With your teeny tiny roots.
I look like it.
Oh, that cook right actually. Oh, nice. Somebody's. Oh yeah. That look is so appealing because I'm like, somebody even made a loop on there, so I was like, oh, it could just be dangling there. You see that green one has like a little loop there.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, it didn't work. How it wasn't incorporated in there, maybe, or it's fine.
Hard to support, hard to strain.
We don't need it to live there for forever. Okay. I feel like, woo! All right, there we go. We've got our prairie roots. All right. All right, so my main point, like I said, for talking about the prairie roots is just, to help illustrate how different the landscape is today from how the landscape was just a relatively short time ago. And so in terms of thinking about landscape restoration and indigenous land management, I think maybe the biggest learning point that I could share from, and I consider myself to be learning in process as well, to be learning more about Dakota and Anishinaabe culture here in Minnesota, to be learning about indigenous land management, but it's much more of a mindset of people being part of nature instead of people being separate from nature. And so thinking about restoring the land, I think sometimes when we think about restoring the land and we're using our, so this is like lovely, and yet also, we're going to do this. There we go. Okay. So I think sometimes we get really excited about land restoration, and in our kind of European American mindset, we think of land restoration as something we do once and then we're done. So we think, I will pull out this map and I will figure out what used to be here. Okie dokie, this was a prairie. I planted the prairie and I'm done. And that is not. It is not really the way nature works. It's not, and it's not a realistic way to approach landscape restoration. So, landscape restoration, I think, if you were going to approach it with more of an indigenous mentality, is thinking how do you reincorporate yourself into the landscape, that you are actively interfacing with nature, you're actively being part of it, because these were never landscapes they were landscapes without people, 15,000 years ago. But for the past 10, 12,000 years, these have not been landscapes that existed without people. So I sometimes become frustrated when I hear there is kind of a subset of environmentalism that says if we can just get the people out, everything will be okay again. And there's a lot of mentality like if we just we set aside a preserve and we just keep people out and everything will be okay. You certainly could do that if that's what your goal is, but I think a better and more realistic goal would be for us to be reconnecting with nature and reconnecting with what our role is in actively managing it. So knowing that if your goal is to have a prairie or to have an oak savanna or oak barrens woodland, it's something that you are going to have to actively manage. Because otherwise you'll restore it to a prairie, and over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, all of the brush, all of the trees are going to creep back in, and 20 years from now you're going to have woods again. So this is going to be something that's going to require constant interaction with the land through prescribed fires. There's a number of different companies that you can work with to do that. You can actually volunteer and learn how to do it yourself if you volunteer in a burn crew and you get certified in how to do prescribed burns. It's going to be things like bringing in a herd of goats to manage the buckthorn and the other invasive species. Because in most places we're not going to be able to have a herd of bison like they do at Bellwood Conservancy. But just kind of having that mindset of this is an active and ongoing process of landscape restoration. And also realizing that when we're looking at these maps, that's just a snapshot in time. That was this one moment in 1847 or 1895, whatever year it was that the surveyor hit the spot. That is what was here at that time. That doesn't mean that's what always needs to be here forever and for always. But that is a goal that you could work towards. And then, being open to the possibility that nature might just not be able to do that anymore because you have all this other surrounding landscape. Now you have parks, you have roads. I've heard that there's a new development coming in that might be sending stormwater onto the property. So there's just all these different influences that weren't here in 1847 and 1895. You might never be able to make the land be exactly the prairie or exactly the oak savanna that it was on the day that the land surveyor arrived. But you can have a really good goal of restoring it to a more natural, healthy ecosystem that is supporting wildlife, is supporting pollinators, is supporting, just the kind of recreational amenities that you want to have. Give me a moment here. I want to check my time to see if I'm yapping at you too long or not. Okay, so I want to maybe talk about a couple of different. I'm not going to set these books in there. That's just going to get lower and lower. Talk about a couple of different resources for you. So the first thing that I wanted to recommend is a couple of different places to go visit or organizations to connect with. And we are really, really lucky in the St. Croix Valley that there are so many natural areas and so many different organizations that are doing landscape protection and restoration work. Right down the road on Highway 95 is the St. Croix Savannah Scientific and Natural Area. And that is one of the only remnant prairies that you can find in our area. And it is so close to you. So if you want to know what used to grow here on this land, go hike there because the plants that are growing there are the plants that were probably growing here. So the two different ways that you can get into there if you have never gotten in there before. The one way is that you can go in through the Inspiration. That's it. Through the Inspiration neighborhood. Hey there, Pooch, how's it going? So you can go in through the Inspiration neighborhood and you can kind of hike in the back way. There is an osprey nest that like in a big lookout box. The other way that I do sometimes, which is really thrilling and also kind of dangerous, is if you park along Highway 95, you can just hug the edge of the road and then get in and walk up. Even though it's a little dangerous, I kind of prefer to go in that way because that gets you into the prairie section right away. But it's a big hilltop, dry prairie. There is poison ivy, so be careful if you're walking there. Be aware of that. but just really, really amazing prairie plants, which are a lot more diverse and a lot different species than you find in the restored prairies. So that's the one reason I would recommend going there. The other place that is very close to here that I'd recommend going is Bellwyn Conservancy, which is down in Afton. And they have a couple of different non-contiguous parcels. They have 1,500 acres altogether. The one that is on Division Street, just south of the Lucy Winton Bellfields, that's where they release the bison every year. So you can't hike in that part, but you can go to the overlook and you can see if you'll see the bison. I never see the bison. It's like once they let them off the truck, you never see them again. But they're out there. They're out there somewhere. But if you keep going further down Stagecoach Trail, there is a parking area where they have public hiking trails. They're open to the public from dawn to dusk every day. And really nice restored prairie there, so you can go walk. It's just beautiful, lovely hills. There's no water, so know that to bring water along with you. If there's ever an opportunity to go to one of the public programs at their main education building, which is even further down Stagecoach Trail, that one is not normally open to the public except for the public programs, but that is where they have the highest quality prairie, actually. Highest quality prairie and highest quality oak savanna restoration. They've been working on some of it since, I think, 1972. So very, very early on in the landscape restoration movement when they started doing the prairie restoration there. So those are two good places to go and get an idea of what used to be here at your property. And then two indigenous organizations that I would recommend. So the first, they just renamed themselves. They were called the Lower Phelan Creek Project, and they're now called Wakan Tipi Wakan Yapi. And they are building a cultural center at what is also known as Bruce Bento Nature Sanctuary in St. Paul, just off of downtown St. Paul. And they are also working on a multi-year project to daylight Phelan Creek. So a lot of people don't know that there used to be a creek that connected Lake Phelan to the Mississippi River. And that entire creek has been buried underground now for 100 years or so. So they're working to daylight a portion, the northernmost portion that comes right off of the lake. And they're actively doing that right now. But they organize birding hikes on the main property down at Bruce Bento Nature Sanctuary, all sorts of like landscape restoration projects and cultural things. So I would just encourage signing up for one of their programs there. I know that I took a tour last summer, and having the tour of a property that I thought I was familiar with, but with a different perspective, having it be a Dakota woman who led the tour, and just the language she used and the way she talked about things was really mind-blowing to me. So for example, we were walking along, and they're at this particular place. It's a very, it is open space, but it's also in a very urban environment. So there's a lot of invasive species. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I learned invasive species existed, that kind of ruined nature hiking for me from then on. It was like from then on, every time I would be out hiking for, the past 20 years of my life now, I'm judging. It's just like, this isn't as good as it should be. That could be better. That might look pretty, but it's actually bad. And, it's like this very judgmental, I don't know, I almost equate it to like diet culture. Like, you're not as skinny as you could be. It's like you're never skinny enough. You never have few enough invasive species. But she had this really different way of talking about it. And she said, well, we don't call them invasive species. We call them displaced plants and animals. Because, she's like, we want everybody to live together. We want all of our relatives, our plant relatives, our tree relatives, our birds to live together in harmony. And sometimes we have to manage them, but they're just trying to make their way in the world. And she said, when we talk about it that way, it seems like people kind of have the permission to enjoy nature again. So instead of walking around judging it the whole time, it's like, well, that poor spotted knapweed. It's just, it's just trying to make its way in the world. They are still actively managing the landscape, but that for me, it felt really nice. Like, oh, I am allowed to enjoy the experience here, even if it's not, the perfect prairie that it should be. And she was talking also about there are a lot of people who don't have homes. who, at times are sleeping there on the property. And, just the way she talked about it, she said, we have, a lot of our unhoused relatives are living here. And that just kind of tells us that we're not doing a good enough job of taking care of one another. So we need to do better. And if this is the place where they can find peace and this is where they can find a safe place to rest at night, that's okay. And to me, that felt really refreshing because it was just so different than the way I hear people talk about homelessness in, modern day culture. But yeah, so I would highly recommend looking up events and activities they're doing. If you're more or also interested in Anishinaabe culture, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission represents, I think it's 10 different tribes that are in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, Michigan, and then southern Canada. And they have a quarterly newsletter, like an actual paper newsletter you can sign up for. And it's really nice because you'll get that mailed to you and it will talk about the different seasons, like kind of share some stories behind that. And I know last year I was lucky enough to get to, not through Cliff, but was lucky enough to get to go wild ricing with a group of Anishinaabe people up in northern Minnesota. And that was a really cool experience for me. I'm going to retie this. Okay, roots. There we go. Stay. And once again, just kind of like when we were out on the boats and we're wild racing, and you're using these big sticks and you're knocking the seeds into your boat. And, once again, kind of in I think the European farming mindset, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm being so efficient because only half of the seeds are falling into the boat and the other half are all landing in the lake. And Gawaden, who was my friend who had invited me to come along, he was telling us, he said, don't worry about it. That's good because wild rice is an annual plant and it needs to have seeds planted in order to grow again the next year. So as you're knocking your seeds into the plant, half are falling into your boat for you to eat and half are falling into the lake to plant themselves and be the wild rice for next year, because the birds also need the wild rice and the insects live in the wild rice. So once again, just having that like different perspective and different mindset, I thought was really cool for me. You might have already talked about this in previous programming that you've been doing, but 2 books that I would recommend, and I'll leave these up here if you wanted to like come right down afterwards, but An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. This looks at kind of all of North America and just the history of different cultures and what they were doing at the time that European Americans came and started colonizing the area. And then Braided Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And this one, so I would read them in order, this one first and this one second, because this one will make you really sad and angry about the world. And then this one will restore your faith again. And, Robin just talks a lot about blending together Indigenous wisdom with scientific knowledge and more like a path forward, how we move forward and reconnect with nature and regain those potentially lost connections. Okay, so then I do have enough copies that I can leave at least 1 or 2 of these with you guys of this Prairies of Minnesota Landowner Handbook. Because this has some like really good guidance about how to do prairie restoration. So know that. I can also leave this 1 copy of Woodlands of Minnesota Landowner Handbook. And this one talks about woodlands in this part of the country, this part of the state, because you have a little bit of both. You're going to have a little bit that will probably always stay woodlands and a little bit that might be maintained more as a prairie. And then the last one, I can't leave you a copy of this because this is my favorite. So you cannot have it. It is my favorite. Bees, an identification and native plant forage guide. This is by Heather Holm. She has 3 books. She has a new one that just came out called Wasps. And then there is a 3rd one that's just pollinators of native plants. But the really cool thing about this one is So say you want to know, oh, a digger bee, what would I plant for a digger bee? And you look here and you see, oh, hoary vervain, blue lobelia, you know, and then you know, okay, I can plant those, and those will be good ones for those kinds of bees. Or vice versa, you can look up the plant that you're thinking of planting, and then figure out all the different kinds of bee species that it would attract. If that's something that you are interested in doing and having a more healthy insect and pollinator ecosystem. So yeah, so these three you can write down, you can take a picture to remember what they are, but you can't have them because they're mine. But the Woodlands of Minnesota Landowner Handbook and the Prairies of Minnesota Landowner Handbook, I can leave copies with you. I normally have like a whole fleet of handouts with me, and I realized that I arrived without my handouts of all sorts of different native plants, but the bluethumb.org website has this really great plant selector tool. And the way that you would use it is that you enter in if you have sun or if you have shade, if it's wet or if it's dry, and then it will generate a list of native plants that grow in those conditions. And so as you're looking at this landscape design that you already have, and I know that Brett Stoppelstad from my office has been out doing a site visit on the property semi-recently with you, Paul. So he'll have a lot of really great recommendations, and he can probably bring handouts also, all the handouts that I forgot to bring with me. But if you're looking on the bluethumb.org website and you're like, well, we want to have a pollinator garden here, you could use that Blue Thumb plant selector tool to find all the native plants that would grow well in that area. And then you could also even cross-reference if you really want it to be good for butterflies or bees. You could cross-reference with one of Heather Holmes' books too to select ones that are extra specially good for pollinators. Okay, I think that might be enough of me talking. How about questions? What kinds of questions?
I think it would be great to either repeat or share the microphone so that people who catch the live recording will hear people's questions also.
Can you talk a little bit about climate change and plants moving?
Yeah, okay, yes, that is a good question. And it kind of speaks to what I was talking about earlier with not being able to expect nature to stay the same as it was in 1847. So we know that our climate in Minnesota is changing and it is getting warmer, particularly during the winter is actually when we're seeing more of the warming trend. And it is getting wetter, but not in the same way that it used to. So what we used to have is a lot of frequent rains that were not that big. And what we have kind of moved into a pattern of now is having a few rains that are enormous rains throughout the year with long stretches of dryness in between. And I think that this summer is a great example when we're only barely into June and it's already almost a drought. You know, the ground is dry, the grass is super dry. And so, you know, thinking of it's actually more like you're planting drought-tolerant species than even though like our annual rainfall is getting bigger, it comes in these big waves, these big, you know, megastorms that cause a lot of flooding. But because they're just a one-time event and they're so big, a lot of the water doesn't end up making it into the ground. I know that we had a couple of, you know, it kind of goes in cycles. We tend to have like 5 to 7 years of wet years and 5 to 7 dry years. But what we're thinking about too with like woodland restoration in particular, people are even starting to experiment with planting some species from southern Minnesota or northern Iowa up here with the anticipation that that is what our climate is going to look like maybe 40 years from now or 50 years from now. So they're kind of trying to, you know, predict what that's going to be and plant species that are going to be more likely to survive in that changing climate. I don't have handouts about it, but we do have like a handout at my office about, you know, which tree species are kind of like the winners and the losers. I mean, obviously don't plant any ash. because emerald ash borer is here. You know, the communities are actively cutting down ash trees. So definitely don't be planting new ash. I think, you know, any kind of oak trees that you wanted to be planting here would be great, you know, great choices. And they're something that is also adapted to, you know, the more southerly climates. So they're going to be doing well, okay. What else? Right, and I realized I didn't pass you the microphone.
Just looking at this landscape, what's your opinion on white pines?
Yeah, so the pines in general are not native to this area. As much as it's funny because, you know, we think of the Stillwater region as being the center of the lumber, you know, the lumber timber experience in this area. But what it was the end of the river where all the pines from further north were being cut down. So when you look at this area, there were naturally some white pines growing just along the river, just along the St. Croix River, and it was more so up around Marina and St. Croix and further north. So there are a few stands like William O'Brien State Park and a little further north that were white pine. Any of the red pine that's growing in this area is all plantation, you know, red pine. And I know I've got them in my yard as well. And if you go down to Bellwyn, they have, you know, a pretty big planted red pine stand. But that is one of the things that in places where people have these planted like red pine stands, a lot of times they're planted close together because they were planted intentionally to be eventually harvested for timber. And so people start to wonder, well, why don't they look very good? You know, they're all growing so close together, and it's just, you know, these spindly little tops. It's because they were planted close together with, you know, whoever planted them intended to eventually be, you know, logging them for timber, likely. Planting, you know, a couple of white pines could work. You know, or if you had like a red pine area, you know, kind of gradually thinning those out and starting to plant some understory trees that are things that, you know, oak doesn't grow in the shade. Oak probably wouldn't grow in a pine plantation, but something like a maple or a basswood. There was one other that was on the tip of my tongue. But yeah, so in general, the pine didn't actually grow in our area. I don't know if it will reach
that's
me.
okay, you can repeat it.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea.
What would you recommend that we could consider planting in this kind of transitional zone we're sitting in? That's kind of turf grass and kind of weeds and stuff. What could work well here that would make some sense?
Sure. So the question is what to consider planting in this transitional zone. And I'm assuming that you want to continue to be able to use it the way we're using it this morning, right? To continue to be able to use it kind of like a lawn. One of the things that we have been doing that's becoming more and more popular are called bee lawns. And this is a mix of fine fescue grasses. And so most people's lawns are Kentucky bluegrass, which is not a very drought tolerant kind of grass. It requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of water, a lot of mowing to be able to look like a lawn. There are fescue species, which are slower growing and more drought tolerant. So that is an option. You could do just fescues. And that's when like people use if they're trying to do a low mow lawn that maybe only has to be mowed a couple of times during the year. But a bee lawn would incorporate the fine fescues and then maybe also some low growing flowering species, creeping thyme, self-heal, clover. There's a few native plants that we have tried with, and they don't tend to do as well in the bee lawn mixtures. But that would be a way to maybe have a little bit more diversity in the plant, but it still functions like a lawn. You can still mow it. You can still use it for sitting around and having your church services in the morning. If you were worried about the flowers attracting bees and people are sitting on top of the bees, then you might want to consider just having the fine fescue grass in this area, and maybe as you get out towards the trees, that's where you're incorporating the flowering species a little bit further away from where people are walking around. You know, and in terms of like how to get there from where you are now until there, the hard way, which would be, you know, pretty labor intensive and expensive probably, is to like kill off all of your existing grass and start over from scratch. You can also interseed. So if you like aerate the soil or, you know, rake it up and seed over the top of it, don't do it at this time of year, especially not when we're about to go into a drought, but it's something that you could do in the fall and have more of those species come up in the spring. And the fine fescue, the flowers would start, you know, taking hold pretty close to right away in the spring. But the fine fescues, it will take them a while to outcompete the Kentucky bluegrass. They'll eventually do it, but it'll take a couple of years for it to happen. But that's a lot cheaper, easier, less labor intensive way to do it if you wanted to transition to something like that. And I know Brett could give some advice on that as well, because we've got a demonstration bee lawn at our yard, or I mean at our office. About anything else?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.